So last week we spoke about relative versus absolute truth. And the idea that there is a consciousness beyond the mind that offers a profoundly different lens upon the world. And we spoke about the fact that most of us live almost entirely in the relative world, which by definition means that we live mostly in and from the mind and the senses. We also spoke about the idea that the supreme consciousness or absolute truth cannot be known through the mind. The mind doesn't have the capacity to reach it, but we can make direct contact with this substratum and ultimately come to rest in this place. We live in a time and a culture in which there are almost no signposts that point to such a consciousness. Often when we hear teachings about that reference source, a source beyond all knowing, which we might call God, the signposts have to do with believing a certain thing. So mysticism might be described as those practices that lead to direct communion with ultimate reality. It may appear as though mysticism in this time and place has gone underground. But here's where it gets interesting. The word mysticism is thought to derive from the ancient Greek word M-U-O, which is pronounced mu, which means to conceal or to close. This word is pointing towards something that is purposely concealed. So we can glean from this that throughout time, to some extent, the mystical has been underground. There are different levels of consciousness within us, and of course any of you that's been on retreat knows that this is a large part of what we're exploring here, right? Most of us live at a level of consciousness that is sourced through our senses and our mind. And there are many people that may not even have a hint of a desire to seek anything else. The mind and the senses provide enough fodder for a specific lifetime. But there are others who sense that there is something deeper within and who have a longing to know that place. And sometimes the longing for something greater starts with profound suffering. And for others, it's a restlessness that won't let us alone. And this is how it was for me, beginning actually in childhood. And this restlessness cannot find an outlet in the world, although we can spend many years trying to meet it or appease it in the external world and in outward ways. But when we seek resolution for spiritual restlessness in the world, it most often won't resolve, even though we may have no idea what it is that we wish for. So we seek, and we often flail around for quite some time, sometimes for years, for lifetimes. I didn't find a true place for my own spiritual restlessness and seeking until I met my teacher David in 2004. And I was 43 years old. 43 years of restlessness. So out of our suffering or our longing for something greater, we might eventually come upon tools which promise to help us access that mystical dimension. But when this is so, remember that we have set out on a path to seek something that is concealed. And many of us are deeply tweaked by this. If I start to really entertain the possibility that this dimension exists, and as a result, I begin to sit in meditation and maybe attend retreats or read spiritual books or do whatever it is that I do, I may wonder why I can't just realize this dimension. My mind has perhaps accepted the journey to some extent. Because we live in a culture that is in fast time. We often wish to realize this deeper and more subtle dimension of our being now. But there's nothing instantaneous about seeking the supreme silence, the supreme consciousness. It requires a great patience. When we start down this path, we are unraveling thousands of years in the making. We are unraveling the entire mind stream, which is made up of millions of imprints and habits from our past and our families, from language, from repetitive emotional patterns, from unhealed wounds, from the unhealed wounds of our ancestors, from lives previously lived, from the cultural stew that we are steeped in. We work through the layers of the mind in slow time. And over time, this place within ourselves is revealed. It is revealed. We don't have to create it. The supreme consciousness is already there. It's already here. It exists in every human being. But at a certain point, we have to do the often arduous work of realizing it. And it's part of the reason why an awakening is called self-realization, right? And this requires some appreciation for the enormity of the task. What we are unraveling is ancient, thousands of years in the making. If I decide to climb Mount Everest, I do not expect to throw a backpack on my back and summit, right? I train, I practice, I learn, I study, I get in physical shape, I work with my mind, my diet, my nervous system. So it's really helpful to remember this, that we're not talking about a pharmaceutical pill that is going to set you on a path to a deeper dimension of yourself. You have to seek this part of yourself in slow time, over time, with a great patience, born of understanding the depth of what it is you are unraveling when you truly begin to quiet the mind. So Westerners often scratch their head in confusion when they hear the idea that on the mystical path, we actually work to quiet the mind so that we can go beyond it. Now, as Westerners, we are fed a cultural diet which almost exclusively references the mind. The mind is culturally reified, and rationalism is often held up as a blanket solution to the problems of humanity. This is not to diminish the mind, but rather to place it in a larger context. As we've become more deeply material, our mind is often viewed as synonymous with our brain. There are times when we are reducing consciousness with a capital C to the grossest level of our being, which is our brain. Instead of seeing the brain as a part of the conduit to a greater consciousness, capital C, that is beyond it. The mind cannot realize the state that is beyond it in the same way that an infant cannot do math. But if you get one small taste of that deepest substratum within you, most of you will not turn back. You will want to find a way to stabilize a relationship to that presence, because that presence is everything we long for. A state of peace and profound equanimity and deep compassion and a genuine humility which is born of apprehending a larger truth. You become a seeker. So we come into a body and we spend our entire years of growing up creating the mind stream, building an identity, cultivating a worldview, figuring out who we are in the world, where we stand, what our gifts are, where we don't stand. We can't skip this step. It's how we were made. Last week, we spoke about the fact that we come from formlessness into form, and then through form, eventually find our way back to the formless in an awakened state. So we are born with an active mind stream. There is a part of the mind stream that's latent at birth, which is another conversation. And we spend our entire youth and young adulthood creating a sense of identity. But if we wish to awaken to the supreme consciousness, we have to ultimately dismantle that very identity. So I would assume that many of you, because you are drawn to this kind of gathering, feel either called to seek or feel drawn to check out what it means to seek. And it's clarifying to have a word that captures that person who find themselves at this particular juncture in their soul's journey, in which they are seeking a higher consciousness. So those on a spiritual path often call themselves seekers. And at one level, this is accurate. But it can also be misleading. There's a way of conceptualizing the journey of the soul that might be described this way. We start out in a merged state with the One, Shiva. And this One gives birth to itself into form or creation, Shakti, or the divine feminine. And then we drop out of that state of oneness and we come into multiplicity. And we do this over and over and over again. The soul's journey, again, is thousands of years in the making. And sometimes we say about another person, that person is an old soul. The Dalai Lama is an old soul. What do we mean by this? We are sensing that some souls have been on this journey either longer than others, perhaps, or find themselves at a mature point in their evolution. We can sense this. So check this out. Over the course of its evolution, every soul will follow a trajectory that will eventually lead to the farthest point from that oneness. Every soul goes on a journey in which it's not actually necessarily linear, in fact it's not, but will make its way to a point that is the furthest it can be from oneness. Every soul does this. And this will look like extreme egoism. It sometimes looks like evil. There's a total eclipse of the sun when we are at this place. Our lives will then be about the senses, and our reference point will be only ourselves. And as a result, there will be extreme suffering, both created by us and within us. And you might describe this as people who have in a certain way lost their humanity. And this creates extreme suffering in the being who has drifted so far from Source. And eventually that soul, through grace, cannot bear the suffering any longer and turns back and begins the journey home. And this is sometimes called involution, returning back to Source. So the hymn, Amazing Grace, was written by a captain who was running slaves from Africa to the New World. And his story is a beautiful and somewhat dramatic demonstration of that moment when the soul cannot bear its own weight any longer, its own darkness. And he wrote Amazing Grace out of his profound gratitude for that turning point back to Source, back to the light. And so when you look around, you will notice that there are people represented at every point of this journey, away from Source and back to it. It's more like a labyrinth, but that's okay. And we will all make this same journey with different storylines. So everyone is ultimately on a journey back to Source. You may have to live 300 lifetimes as a glutton to discover its limitations. So the seeker of truth might assume that if you aren't sitting on a meditation pillow, attempting to quiet the mind, you aren't a seeker. But everyone is seeking. And the expression of that journey is the play of consciousness. In a certain lifetime, I may never move towards anything that would be described as remotely mystical. But I may be a warrior, learning courage and loyalty and stamina. Or I may be in an incarnation in which my soul is longing to connect to the earth, to know the earth. And I spend my entire life with my hands deep in the soil. And this is my path. This is my spiritual practice. Or I may be in a trajectory in which I am profoundly devoted to social justice or the reform of government, and I may never have any spiritual inclination whatsoever, and this is my spiritual practice or my sadhana. And I may be in another lifetime in which I'm living out a trajectory that started a long, long time ago, and its beginning is no longer in my sight, resulting in a life in prison or a death at a young age or a lifetime of physical pain. And my perspective is limited only to this lifetime. And my suffering might be so great that I cannot, for the life of me, understand why my life is what it is. And in these lifetimes, we often just need each other to carry on. One of my favorite spiritual stories that illustrates what I'm speaking about is a story that I encountered through a British documentary called Man on Wire. And the film was made in 2008, and it's the story of a Frenchman by the name of Philippe Petit, who was a high wire artist, which is a form of tight wire walking that is performed at great heights. This was Philippe's great love. This was his purpose, this lifetime, to master wire walking, which on the surface may appear to some as frivolous. Perhaps his parents would have preferred that he become a doctor. The movie is the story of Philippe and a small group of cohorts breaking into the World Trade Center over the course of a few days, while the World Trade Center was still under construction, and placing a tight wire between the two twin towers. And then on August 7th in 1974, in the wee hours of the morning, during rush hour, Philippe spends 45 minutes dancing across the high wire without any kind of safety device, dancing between the two towers. Now let's be clear. Philippe was not an overtly spiritual seeker in any way, shape, or form. He was rebellious and unorthodox, a total maverick, a womanizer. He was very much of this world. But from a different perspective other than just the worldly one, his sadhana was to master concentration and one-pointed attention, to master courage and focus, and a release into a state that would then carry him along. Because in order to perform this feat, he had to lay down the mind and let another part of himself take over. In my eyes, this is a profoundly spiritual man. So most of us only have a hint of our soul's journey. We often don't know where we are in time and space in relationship to the soul's evolution or involution. When Philippe comes back, assuming that he does, he will have mastered necessary skills for his ultimate spiritual awakening. And that may not appear for many, many lifetimes. It doesn't matter. So we cannot just look at the person who is interested in tapping into a deeper substratum within his or her being as the seeker. It is indeed helpful to have a name for this particular juncture in our soul's evolution. But it's also so important to remember that we come to know the formless through form. And some people's exploration is almost purely form-based. And this has deep integrity in its own right.